The morning sun cast long shadows across Ouagadougou International Airport as security personnel began their routine checks. It was supposed to be another ordinary day in Burkina Faso's capital, but nothing could have prepared them for what they were about to discover. Ambassador Henri Dubois adjusted his expensive watch nervously as he approached the departure gate. The 58-year-old French diplomat had served in various African countries for over 2 decades, but today felt different. His usually confident demeanor showed cracks of anxiety as he wheeled his diplomatic luggage through the terminal. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, head of airport security, noticed something unusual about the ambassador's behavior. Despite having diplomatic immunity and the right to pass through security without detailed searches, Dubois seemed overly concerned about his luggage. The ambassador kept glancing at his 2 large suitcases, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the air conditioning. The political climate in Burkina Faso had changed dramatically since Captain Ibrahim Traoré took power in September 2022. The young military leader had made it clear that his government would crack down on corruption and illegal activities regardless of who was involved. Foreign diplomats no longer felt untouchable in this new era of accountability. As Dubois presented his diplomatic passport, Captain Traoré made a decision that would shake the foundations of Franco-Burkinabe relations. Something in the ambassador's nervous energy triggered his professional instincts. He had seen this behavior before in his years of security work, and it usually meant trouble. The captain quietly signaled to his team while maintaining a polite conversation with the ambassador. Dubois spoke fluent French with airport staff, discussing his upcoming flight to Paris and mentioning urgent diplomatic matters that required his immediate attention. But his hands trembled slightly as he handed over his documents. Unknown to Dubois, intelligence reports had been circulating for weeks about suspicious activities involving gold trafficking through diplomatic channels. Burkina Faso, rich in gold reserves, had become a target for illegal mining operations and smuggling networks. The new government under Traoré had been cracking down hard on these activities. The ambassador's departure had been hastily arranged, which also raised red flags. According to diplomatic protocols, such sudden departures usually required advance notice, but Dubois had requested immediate travel clearance just 24 hours earlier. His staff at the French embassy had seemed surprised by the sudden urgency. Captain Traoré approached Dubois with professional courtesy but firm determination. He explained that despite diplomatic immunity, recent security protocols required additional verification procedures for all international departures. The ambassador's face turned pale as he realized his assumptions about diplomatic protection might not hold in Traoré's Burkina Faso. The airport terminal buzzed with its usual activity, but tension began building around the diplomatic departure area. Other passengers noticed the extended conversation between security officials and the well-dressed man with expensive luggage. Some recognized him as a foreign diplomat from his bearing and attire. Dubois attempted to assert his diplomatic status, speaking in rapid French and English, demanding to speak with embassy officials. He pulled out his phone to make calls, but Captain Traoré politely requested that he cooperate with the security procedures first. The captain's calm but firm approach made it clear this was not a negotiable request. The ambassador's 2 large suitcases sat nearby, looking innocent enough but somehow drawing everyone's attention. They were expensive leather cases, the kind typically used by high-ranking diplomats for important documents and personal items. But today, these ordinary-looking bags would become the center of an international incident. As more security personnel arrived, Dubois realized his situation was becoming serious. The confident diplomat who had walked into the airport an hour earlier was now visibly shaking. His phone calls to the embassy seemed to provide little comfort, and the responses he received appeared to increase his anxiety rather than calm his nerves. Captain Traoré made the call to Captain Ibrahim Traoré's office. The young leader had specifically instructed his security forces to investigate any suspicious activities thoroughly, without regard for diplomatic status or international pressure. This directive was about to be tested in the most dramatic way possible. The standoff at the airport was just beginning, and neither the ambassador nor the security team could have predicted how this encounter would expose one of the biggest gold Smuggling operations in West African diplomatic history. The airport security office became a pressure cooker, as Ambassador Dubois found himself in an unprecedented situation. For the first time in his diplomatic career, his immunity was being challenged by local authorities who seemed unimpressed by his status and connections. Captain Sawadogo received direct orders from the presidential palace. Captain Ibrahim Traoré himself had been briefed about the situation and gave clear instructions to proceed with the investigation. The young military leader's message was simple but powerful. No one was above the law in the new Burkina Faso, regardless of their diplomatic status or nationality. Dubois paced nervously in the security office, making frantic phone calls to the French embassy in Ouagadougou. His conversations grew increasingly heated as embassy staff struggled to understand how their ambassador had ended up in detention at the airport. The French embassy's legal team was scrambling to invoke diplomatic protocols that seemed ineffective against Traoré's new administration. Meanwhile, technical experts arrived with specialized equipment to examine the ambassador's luggage. The suitcases, which had seemed ordinary from the outside, were about to reveal secrets that would shock everyone present. The first case opened with a soft click, and what they found inside changed everything. Hidden beneath layers of diplomatic documents and personal belongings, the security team discovered carefully concealed compartments. These weren't visible to casual inspection, but the expert examination revealed sophisticated hiding places designed by professionals. The ambassador's expensive luggage had been modified to smuggle valuable items without detection. As the first gold bars emerged from the secret compartments, the room fell silent. Each bar was carefully wrapped in diplomatic papers to avoid metal detectors, and they bore markings that identified them as raw gold from local mining operations. The weight and quality of the gold indicated this was not a small-scale operation, but part of a massive smuggling network. Captain Sawadogo counted 17 gold bars from the first suitcase alone. Each piece represented significant value, but more importantly, they represented stolen wealth from Burkina Faso's natural resources. The young captain understood immediately that this discovery would have international implications far beyond a single diplomatic incident. Ambassador Dubois collapsed into a chair as his carefully planned escape unraveled. His face showed the expression of a man whose entire career and reputation were crumbling in real time. The confident diplomat who had entered the airport was now a suspected criminal facing the possibility of international scandal and personal ruin. The second suitcase proved even more damaging. Along with additional gold bars, investigators found detailed documentation of the smuggling operation. Bank account numbers, contact information for buyers in Europe, and shipping manifests painted a picture of systematic theft that had been operating for months, possibly years. Phone records found in the suitcase revealed communications with mining company executives, local officials who had been bribed to look the other way, and international buyers who had been purchasing the stolen gold. The ambassador had not been working alone but was clearly a key figure in a complex criminal network spanning multiple countries. Captain Ibrahim Traoré was immediately informed of the discoveries. The young leader's response was swift and decisive. He ordered a complete investigation into all diplomatic activities related to gold exports and demanded a full accounting of Burkina Faso's mining operations. This single arrest was about to expose corruption that reached into the highest levels of international relations. News of the detention began to spread despite attempts to keep the investigation quiet. Social media posts from airport witnesses started appearing online, and journalists began gathering outside the terminal. The story was too big to contain, and public interest was growing rapidly as rumors of gold smuggling involving foreign diplomats spread throughout Ouagadougou. The French embassy found itself in an impossible position. Defending their ambassador meant potentially covering up criminal activity, while abandoning him would damage France's diplomatic relationships throughout Africa. Embassy officials struggled to craft a response that would protect both their country's interests and their ambassador's rights. Legal experts on both sides began preparing for what promised to be a complex international legal battle. Diplomatic immunity had traditionally protected ambassadors from local prosecution, but Burkina Faso's new leadership was challenging these old assumptions. The case would test the boundaries of international law in ways that hadn't been seen for decades. As evening approached, Ambassador Dubois remained in custody while investigators continued cataloging evidence. The gold bars were photographed, weighed, and tested to confirm their origin. Each piece of evidence strengthened the case against the diplomat and revealed more details about the extensive criminal network he had been operating. The international implications were becoming clear to everyone involved. This was not just about one corrupt diplomat, but about systematic exploitation of African resources by foreign officials who had assumed they were untouchable. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's bold stance was sending a message that would be heard in diplomatic circles around the world. The news broke like a thunderstorm across international media networks. CNN, BBC, and France 24 picked up the story within hours, turning a local airport incident into a global diplomatic crisis. Headlines screamed about French diplomats caught smuggling gold, and the story dominated news cycles across Europe and Africa. Captain Ibrahim Traoré called an emergency press conference at the presidential palace in Ouagadougou. The young military leader appeared calm and confident as he faced a room full of international journalists, many of whom had flown in specifically to cover this unprecedented story. His message was clear and unwavering. Burkina Faso would not tolerate the theft of its natural resources by anyone, regardless of their diplomatic status. Speaking in both French and English, Traoré explained that Ambassador Dubois had been caught with over 40 pounds of raw gold hidden in specially modified diplomatic luggage. The value exceeded $2 million, representing wealth that belonged to the people of Burkina Faso, but was being stolen through diplomatic channels. The young leader's voice remained steady as he detailed the evidence against the French ambassador. In Paris, the French Foreign Ministry was in crisis mode. Emergency meetings ran late into the night as officials tried to manage the diplomatic fallout. France's relationships with its former African colonies were already strained due to changing political dynamics across the continent, and this scandal threatened to damage French influence in the region permanently. Ambassador Dubois, meanwhile, remained in a secure facility in Ouagadougou, his diplomatic immunity in legal limbo. His lawyers argued that international law protected him from prosecution, but Burkina Faso's legal team countered that diplomatic immunity could not cover criminal activities that violated the host country's sovereignty and natural resources. The evidence against Dubois continued to mount as investigators traced the money trail. Bank records showed regular transfers to accounts in Switzerland, Luxembourg, and the Cayman Islands. The amount suggested that the ambassador had been operating this smuggling network for at least 3 years, stealing millions of dollars worth of gold during his diplomatic posting. Local mining communities in Burkina Faso began coming forward with stories about foreign officials who had been paying bribes for access to gold deposits. Village chiefs reported meetings with European men in expensive suits who promised development aid in exchange for mining rights. But the promised assistance never materialized while the gold disappeared from their lands. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's government announced the formation of a special commission to investigate all foreign involvement in Burkina Faso's mining sector. The commission would examine contracts, licenses, and relationships between foreign diplomats and local mining operations. This investigation promised to expose corruption that extended far beyond Ambassador Dubois. International legal experts debated the case on news programs worldwide. Some argued that diplomatic immunity was absolute and that Burkina Faso was violating international law by detaining the French ambassador. Others countered that immunity should not protect criminal activity, especially when it involved stealing natural resources from developing nations. The African Union issued a statement supporting Burkina Faso's right to investigate crimes committed on its territory. This backing from regional neighbors strengthened Traoré's position and signaled a broader shift in how African nations were willing to challenge former colonial powers. The statement was seen as historic by many observers. French President Emmanuel Macron faced mounting pressure to respond to the crisis. Opposition politicians in France demanded explanations about how a French ambassador could operate a criminal network under the government's oversight. Macron's administration found itself defending both their ambassadors' rights and France's reputation simultaneously. Behind closed doors, French diplomats were working frantically to negotiate a quiet resolution. They offered various forms of compensation and cooperation in exchange for Dubois' release, but Traoré's government insisted that justice must be served publicly. The young leader refused to make deals that would allow corruption to continue hidden from public view. Social media exploded with commentary about the case, much of it supporting Burkina Faso's stance against diplomatic corruption. Hashtags like Gold Justice and Africa First trended across multiple platforms as people shared stories about resource exploitation and foreign corruption in African countries. The case was becoming a symbol of resistance against colonial-era attitudes. The French embassy in Ouagadougou faced protests as citizens demanded justice for the theft of their national resources. Demonstrators carried signs reading "Our gold, our future," and called for all foreign mining operations to be investigated. The embassy was forced to increase security as public anger grew over the scandal. Ambassador Dubois' family in France went into hiding as media attention focused on their lifestyle and assets. Journalists discovered that the ambassador owned multiple properties in expensive French neighborhoods, raising questions about how a career diplomat could afford such wealth on a government salary. The investigation was expanding beyond the gold smuggling to encompass broader financial crimes. International mining companies with operations in Burkina Faso began reviewing their security procedures and local partnerships. The scandal had exposed how easily diplomatic channels could be used to smuggle valuable resources, and companies feared being associated with similar criminal activities. Stock prices for several mining firms dropped as investors worried about exposure to corruption scandals. 3 days into the crisis, shocking new evidence emerged that expanded the scandal far beyond Ambassador Dubois. Burkina Faso's investigators, working around the clock, uncovered a network of corruption that involved multiple embassies, international mining corporations, and high-ranking officials across West Africa. The breakthrough came when investigators cracked the encryption on Dubois' laptop computer, which had been seized along with his luggage. The device contained thousands of emails, financial documents, and communication records that painted a picture of systematic resource theft spanning multiple countries and involving dozens of co-conspirators. Captain Ibrahim Traoré personally reviewed the evidence before calling another press conference. This time, his revelation sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles worldwide. The investigation had uncovered what appeared to be an organized, criminal network using diplomatic pouches and immunity to smuggle gold, diamonds, and other precious resources from at least 6 African countries. The email evidence showed that Ambassador Dubois was not the mastermind, but rather a mid-level operator in a sophisticated international crime syndicate. Communications revealed coordinators in Paris, London, and Dubai who managed the logistics of moving stolen resources to international markets. Swiss bank accounts held millions of dollars in proceeds from these operations. Mining company executives appeared frequently in the communications, discussing bribes, false documentation, and methods for avoiding government oversight. Several major international corporations faced immediate scrutiny as their names appeared in connection with the illegal activities. Their stock values plummeted as investors feared the legal and financial consequences. Local officials in multiple African countries were also implicated in the evidence. Village chiefs, regional governors, and customs officers had been receiving payments to facilitate the illegal mining and smuggling operations. The scope of corruption revealed in Dubois's files suggested that entire government departments had been compromised. The French government's position became increasingly difficult as evidence mounted against their ambassador. Intelligence agencies in Paris launched their own investigation to determine how much the foreign ministry knew about Dubois' activities. The scandal was threatening to bring down senior officials who had oversight responsibility for African diplomatic missions. Captain Ibrahim Traoré used the evidence to make unprecedented demands of the international community. He called for the freezing of all bank accounts connected to the smuggling network, the return of stolen resources, and the prosecution of co-conspirators in their home countries. These demands challenged the traditional immunity that diplomats and international corporations had enjoyed. Interpol issued arrest warrants for 12 individuals identified in the evidence as key figures in the smuggling network. The warrants covered suspects in France, Belgium, Switzerland, and the United Arab Emirates, turning a local incident into a global law enforcement operation. Several arrests were made within 48 hours of the warrants being issued. The African Union convened an emergency session to address the revelations about systematic resource theft. Representatives from affected countries shared similar stories of diplomatic corruption and corporate exploitation. The session resulted in a joint declaration demanding new international protocols for monitoring diplomatic activities in resource-rich regions. Village communities across Burkina Faso organized celebrations as news of the investigation spread. For generations, local people had watched foreign officials and corporations extract valuable resources while their communities remained in poverty. Traoré's bold stand against corruption gave hope that this exploitation might finally be ending. International human rights organizations praised Burkina Faso's investigation while calling for protection of witnesses and investigators. Several individuals who had provided evidence about the smuggling network reported receiving threats, and security was increased for key figures in the case. The stakes were rising as more people came forward with information. Ambassador Dubois, still in custody, began cooperating with investigators in exchange for potential leniency. His detailed confessions revealed the inner workings of the smuggling network and implicated additional individuals who had not appeared in the digital evidence. Each revelation expanded the scope of the international investigation. Banking authorities in Switzerland, Luxembourg, and other financial havens came under intense pressure to freeze accounts and provide transaction records related to the case. The amounts involved were staggering, with some estimates suggesting that over $50 million in stolen African resources had passed through these accounts over the past 5 years. The European Union faced criticism for failing to monitor the activities of its diplomatic personnel in Africa adequately. Parliamentary committees in multiple European countries announced investigations into diplomatic oversight procedures and the systems meant to prevent corruption by foreign service officers. Media investigations revealed that warning signs about Dubois' activities had been ignored for years. Embassy staff had reported his unusual lifestyle and frequent unexplained absences, but these concerns were dismissed by superiors in Paris. The failure of oversight systems was becoming a major part of the scandal. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's government announced the establishment of a new international task force to combat resource theft and diplomatic corruption. The task force would work with law enforcement agencies worldwide to track stolen resources and prosecute individuals involved in these networks. This initiative promised to change how international crime affecting African resources would be investigated and prosecuted. The international legal battle reached its climax as the International Court of Justice in The Hague agreed to hear arguments about diplomatic immunity in cases involving resource theft. France had formally requested the court's intervention, arguing that Burkina Faso's detention of Ambassador Dubois violated international diplomatic conventions that had governed relations between nations for centuries. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's legal team, supported by international human rights lawyers and legal scholars from African universities, prepared their counter-arguments. They contended that diplomatic immunity had never been intended to protect criminal activities, especially those involving the systematic theft of a host nation's natural resources and sovereignty. The courtroom in The Hague became the focal point of global attention as representatives from both nations presented their cases. France's lawyers argued that allowing any country to prosecute foreign diplomats would destroy the entire system of international relations and make diplomatic service impossible. Their presentation emphasized centuries of legal precedent protecting diplomatic personnel. Burkina Faso's legal team presented a powerful argument that resonated far beyond the courtroom. They showed evidence of systematic resource theft, detailed the impact on local communities, and argued that immunity should not protect crimes against humanity and national sovereignty. Their presentation included testimony from village elders, whose communities had been devastated by illegal mining operations. The evidence presented in court was devastating. Financial records showed that over $80 million in gold and other resources had been stolen from Burkina Faso and neighboring countries through diplomatic channels. The money had been used to purchase luxury properties, private jets, and offshore investments, while local communities remained in poverty. Judge Sarah Chen, presiding over the case, questioned both legal teams intensively about the boundaries of diplomatic immunity. Her question suggested that the court was seriously considering whether traditional interpretations of diplomatic protection needed to be updated for the modern era of international crime and resource exploitation. Public opinion worldwide was shifting in favor of Burkina Faso's position. Protests outside the court in The Hague supported Traoré's stance, with demonstrators carrying signs reading "Justice for Africa" and "End Diplomatic Crime." Social media campaigns generated millions of posts supporting the prosecution of corrupt diplomats regardless of their nationality or status. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, Ambassador Dubois' detention conditions became a secondary issue in international negotiations. His lawyers argued that he was being held in substandard facilities, but Burkina Faso officials responded that he was receiving the same treatment as any other suspected criminal, which was appropriate given the serious charges against him. The scandal had already claimed political casualties in Paris. 2 senior foreign ministry officials resigned amid revelations that they had ignored reports about suspicious diplomatic activities in Africa. A parliamentary committee was investigating how French diplomatic oversight had failed so completely in allowing criminal networks to operate through embassy channels. Corporate executives began accepting plea bargains in various countries as prosecutors built cases against the international mining companies involved in the smuggling network. Several major firms agreed to pay massive fines and implement new compliance procedures in exchange for avoiding criminal prosecution of their senior leadership. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's government used the international attention to highlight broader issues of economic justice and resource sovereignty. The young leader addressed the United Nations General Assembly, calling for new international frameworks to prevent the exploitation of developing nations' resources by foreign diplomatic and corporate entities. The speech at the UN was watched by millions worldwide and marked a turning point in how African leaders were willing to challenge traditional power structures. Traoré spoke passionately about economic colonialism and the right of African nations to benefit from their own natural resources without interference from corrupt foreign officials. Back in The Hague, legal experts were calling the case a potential watershed moment in international law. The court's decision would either reinforce traditional diplomatic immunities or establish new precedents that would allow countries to prosecute foreign officials for crimes committed on their territory, regardless of diplomatic status. Swiss banking authorities announced the freezing of 47 accounts connected to the smuggling network, containing over $30 million in suspected stolen assets. The cooperation from financial institutions marked a significant victory for Burkina Faso's investigation and demonstrated growing international support for combating diplomatic crime. Intelligence agencies across Europe began reviewing the activities of their diplomatic personnel in Africa following the Dubois revelations. Several countries quietly recalled ambassadors and embassy staff pending internal investigations, suggesting that the corruption exposed in Burkina Faso was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern. Local communities in Burkina Faso organized to reclaim mining sites that had been illegally exploited by foreign operations. With government support, villages began establishing community-controlled mining cooperatives that would ensure local people benefited from their natural resources instead of seeing wealth extracted by corrupt foreign networks. The case was transforming, from a simple diplomatic incident into a symbol of resistance against economic exploitation. African leaders across the continent expressed support for Traoré's stance, with several countries announcing their own investigations into suspicious diplomatic activities related to resource extraction. As the legal proceedings continued, evidence kept emerging about the extent of the criminal network. Phone intercepts revealed conversations between diplomats, corporate executives, and government officials discussing methods for avoiding detection while stealing resources. Each new revelation strengthened Burkina Faso's case and increased pressure on countries to reform their diplomatic oversight systems. 6 months after Ambassador Dubois' dramatic arrest at Ouagadougou International Airport, the International Court of Justice delivered its historic ruling. In a groundbreaking 12-3 decision, the court established that diplomatic immunity could not protect criminal activities that violated the sovereignty and natural resources of host nations. Judge Sarah Chen's majority opinion sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles worldwide. The court ruled that while diplomatic immunity remained important for normal diplomatic functions, it could not serve as a shield for systematic criminal enterprises that exploited host countries' resources. The decision established new international, legal precedents that would reshape diplomatic relations globally. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood before a crowd of thousands in Ouagadougou as the ruling was announced. The young leader's bold stance had not only vindicated his government's actions, but had also established Burkina Faso as a leader in the fight against international corruption and resource exploitation. The celebration in the capital lasted for 3 days. Ambassador Dubois was formally sentenced to 15 years in prison by a Burkina Faso court, with his diplomatic immunity officially revoked by the International Court's decision. He became the first foreign ambassador in modern history to face criminal prosecution in his host country for crimes committed while serving in diplomatic capacity. The French government, facing enormous domestic and international pressure, began implementing sweeping reforms of its diplomatic service. New oversight mechanisms were established to monitor diplomatic personnel, and mandatory financial disclosure requirements were instituted for all foreign service officers. The scandal had fundamentally changed how France managed its diplomatic operations. Corporate prosecutions proceeded rapidly following the court's decision. 7 major international mining companies paid a combined $2.3 billion in fines and restitution to affected African countries. The money was used to establish development funds that would ensure local communities benefited from their natural resources, instead of foreign criminal networks. The Swiss banking authorities released detailed reports showing how the stolen resources had been laundered through international financial systems. Their investigation led to the prosecution of dozens of bank officers and financial advisors who had facilitated the money laundering operations. New international banking regulations were implemented to prevent similar crimes. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's government used the recovered assets to launch major development projects across Burkina Faso. Schools, hospitals, and infrastructure projects were built with money that had been stolen from the country's gold reserves. The visible improvements in people's lives validated the difficult decision to challenge traditional diplomatic immunity. Other African countries began following Burkina Faso's example, investigating suspicious diplomatic activities and demanding accountability from foreign officials operating on their territory. Within a year, similar cases emerged in Ghana, Mali, and Niger, suggesting that the corruption exposed in Ouagadougou was part of a continent-wide problem. The United Nations established a new international monitoring agency, specifically designed to prevent resource theft through diplomatic channels. The agency was headquartered in Accra, Ghana, marking the first time an African city hosted a major UN anti-corruption institution. Captain Ibrahim Traoré was appointed to the agency's advisory board. Ambassador Dubois, serving his sentence in a Burkina Faso prison, became a symbol of the changing power dynamics between Africa and its former colonial powers. His case was studied in law schools worldwide as an example of how international justice could evolve to address modern forms of exploitation and corruption. The French embassy in Ouagadougou implemented unprecedented transparency measures, including public reporting of all mining-related activities and regular community meetings to discuss embassy operations. These changes were replicated at French diplomatic missions across Africa as the government worked to rebuild trust with African nations. Local mining communities in Burkina Faso established cooperative organizations that gave villages direct control over mining operations on their lands. These cooperatives, supported by recovered stolen assets, became models for community-controlled resource extraction that other African countries began adopting. The case inspired a new generation of African leaders who were willing to challenge traditional power structures and demand accountability from foreign entities operating in their countries. Young political leaders across the continent cited Captain Ibrahim Traoré's handling of the Dubois case as proof that African nations could successfully stand up to international pressure. International law schools began teaching the Dubois case as a landmark example of how legal precedents evolved to address contemporary challenges. The case demonstrated that traditional concepts like diplomatic immunity could be adapted to prevent their abuse by criminal networks while still protecting legitimate diplomatic functions. European governments implemented new training programs for diplomatic personnel, emphasizing ethical conduct and the legal boundaries of diplomatic immunity. The programs included specific modules on resource extraction, anti-corruption measures, and respect for host nation sovereignty, directly inspired by the lessons learned from the Burkina Faso scandal. 5 years after the original arrest, Captain Ibrahim Traoré was elected president of Burkina Faso in democratic elections that international observers praised as free and fair. His victory was widely attributed to his successful handling of the diplomatic corruption scandal and his commitment to protecting national resources for the benefit of all citizens. The gold mines that had been illegally exploited by Dubois' network were transformed into legitimate operations that provided employment for thousands of local people and generated substantial revenue for national development. These mines became symbols of how African countries could reclaim control over their natural wealth and use it for genuine development rather than foreign enrichment. The international court's ruling in the Dubois case continued to influence legal decisions worldwide, establishing the principle that sovereignty over natural resources was a fundamental right that international law must protect. The case became required reading in international relations courses and influenced diplomatic training programs globally, ensuring that the lessons learned would shape international relations for generations to come.